Hello, so I'm going to be talking about leader-member exchange theory, also abbreviated LMX. Okay, so starting off with some history on the leader-member exchange theory, it actually started out as the vertical dyad linkage theory, which is abbreviated VDL, by Dansereau, Grain, and Haga in 1975. Grain is kind of the mastermind behind this whole theory, so you'll see that name a lot throughout this presentation. So in 1995, Grain and Olbein divided leader-member exchange theory into three different domains, which I will kind of break down later to you. And I will also go over the two basic types of linkages that was explained in Nordhaus. So there is two different groups in leader-member exchange theory, and that is the in-group versus the out-group. So I figured I would start from the very beginning and go over what the main idea for vertical dyad linkage theory. So it was originally developed by Dansereau, Grain, and Haga in response due to realizing that it's been more than 20 years of active research. Contemporary models of leadership within organizations have failed to develop beyond rather primitive levels. So basically they were saying that the research is old, it's not up to snuff anymore, so they kind of want to explore more information and kind of build off of what that basic principle was that they had. So they wanted to change from looking at followers as one entity as the work group, and also change from assuming that each leader treats every member of the work group the same way. So that is how leader-member exchanges were looked at before, as the followers were one person, basically, was the work group as one entity, and then the leader treated everyone the same, which isn't the case. So that's why they wanted to update this and get more research. And then, so yes, they wanted to focus on the vertical dyads and then the relationship between the leader and follower within that specific dyad. So they wanted to look at how the leader treats each follower and how the relationships differ within that organization. Vertical dyad linkage theory allowed for a variety of relationships within that organization between a leader and a follower. And then they also broke it down to the leadership relationships versus supervision relationships. So with that, they were meaning that leadership relationships are how they would treat someone in their close group, how they would lead the person, supervise them, and give them more responsibility. And then the supervision group relationships were just between the leaders and followers, the followers that were only there to do their job and go home. They didn't want to do any extra work. They didn't have a relationship other than just, this is my boss and that's it. So the three domains of leadership, so Grain and Olbein in 1995 decided that a taxonomy needed to be developed that more clearly reflects the multifaceted nature of leadership situations. So this idea led them to suggest that we address leadership in a different way to gain a better understanding of the process as a whole. So they broke it down to not just leadership as one main idea and break that down into looking at the leader, the follower, and then the relationship between the leader and the follower. So since leadership encompasses all three domains, they decided that it would be easier to classify what part of leadership you were addressing. And they mentioned in their research that it was difficult to classify research on just plain leadership because there's no classification. You don't know if it's about the leader, the follower, if it's the relationship. It wasn't very specific, so they wanted to come up with a way to categorize that. They also mentioned that the taxonomy suggests more studies at that time take a multi-domain approach instead of just addressing one. So instead of just looking at, say, a follower, they wanted you to look at the whole process. So the 3 domains, the leader, follower, and relationship, which is what led us into the leader-member exchange theory. So now we're going to look at the different stages in development of leader-member exchange. So the first stage is the vertical dyad linkage. So that basically is developing that initial dyad between the boss and the employee, or leader and follower. So the validation of differentiation within work units. So that's essentially when you start your job, you know who the boss is, you've met, but you don't have a relationship, you're not acquaintances, and that's about it. So that's just the initial developing the relationship, and that's it. So stage 2 is the leader-member exchange. So that is the validation of differentiated relationship for organizational outcomes. So that translates to developing more of a relationship with your boss within the work, and then developing a network surrounding that construct. So that is like when you have your job and your boss is kind of picking your brains, seeing what your ability is and seeing how much responsibility they can give you. And that's kind of the acquaintance stage of the whole exchange. So stage 3 is leadership making. So that is the theory and exploration of dyadic relationship development. So that is when your boss can start to trust you, you can kind of start to trust them. It's also when the leader kind of looks at how they might work with each person on a one-on-one basis to develop a relationship with each one. So that's when they're deciding that you have the ability and you have the initiative as an employee or follower to go above and beyond what your basic job description is. And that's kind of the whole idea behind leader-member exchange theory, is that having a follower who has the ability and initiative to do more than just show up to work, do the job, and then leave. They're looking at that specific motivation from the employee to kind of take a little bit off of the leader's shoulders. So stage 4 is the team-making competence network. So that is the investigation of assembling dyads into larger collectives. So that means 2 things. So the 4th stage of the leader-member exchange is when you finally hit where you have a great relationship with that leader and they trust you to do extra things. You like your job because you feel empowered and you have extra responsibilities. You show up to work to do work and you like to do more than what your normal job description is. And then you have a good relationship with your boss. You can communicate about things that are more than just work related. A lot of times there's been references of they'll talk about personal things too. So they just have a very good, strong relationship dyad between that leader and follower. They also mentioned how that scope broadened from just the dyad to the larger collective. So that basically means that the leader has assembled different relationships or dyads between each employee, and that has made it into a larger organization. So the life cycle of leadership making. So that is kind of what I mentioned in the previous slide. So you start out as strangers. So Grain and Ulbein in 1995 defined that as role finding. So that's, like I said, when you start the job, you're kind of starting to get to know each other. That 3rd stage is in the acquaintance stage, which is where you're role making. So you're establishing who you are, what you can do, and the leader is looking at who you are and what you can do. So then they can decide on what kind of roles to give you and how much responsibility to put on your shoulders. And then that third bit of the life cycle is the maturity. So that's the role implementation. So that's where they give you the extra responsibility, you want the extra responsibility, and you're competent and motivated to do it. So some information about the in-group versus the out-group. So leader-member exchange theory, the main idea that they try to express is that relationship between the leader and follower. So that life cycle that I just talked about kind of looks more at the in-group. So the in-group are the ones that are more motivated to be at work. They go above and beyond their job responsibilities, and they really like their job. They like the leader. They have a good relationship. The out-group are the ones that abide by their formal employment contracts. So they just show up to work, they just work, and then they go home. There's no extra communication besides strictly work information between the follower and leader. So a lot of the research has determined that the relationship is determined by how well they get along and work with the leader as the follower. So the personality and other personal traits are huge factors in this. And then it also is based on how followers get involved and express interest in doing extra work. So that is the showing initiative and having motivation to do more. So doing something for the leader and then that leader does something for you, that is also a key part of this. Grain mentioned in one of his articles that leader-member exchange theory is both transactional and transformational. So that would be the transactional part of the theory. And it also went on to mention that if the followers are not interested in doing extra, then they become the out group. So sometimes it's not intentional, it just happens, but a lot of times a lot of the research is showing that it's preferred to have the in group than the out group. So what does the research say? So there is a ton of research on leader-member exchange theory. It is a very important and key theory, I think, in work life and especially at the organizational level. So there has been research that found there's a high quality leader-member exchanges lead to, this was all from Nordhaus, lower number of employee turnover, higher performance evaluations and rate of promotions, higher commitment to the organization, enjoyable work assignments, better job attitudes and participation, more support and attention from the leader, and faster career progress within 25 years. So all of that goes back to feeling empowered, having the motivation, wanting to be promoted, wanting to stay at that organization because you have a good relationship with the leader and follower, enjoying your work because you get along with the people that you're with, you would have a better attitude from that, and on and on. So some more research. So Gerstner and Day did a study in 1997 that showed that there was a consistent correlation to overall higher job performance and satisfaction in followers. So there were multiple studies that came to that conclusion. Another study that was done in 2009 by Harris, Kakmar, and Wheeler was that empowerment moderates the relationships between leader-member exchange and job outcomes. So that kind of goes back to if you're in that in-group, you're happier at your job, you don't want to leave because you like who you work with, and you like what you do because you go above what your normal job description is. So that would show that there's a good relationship between positive relationship with the leader and positive job outcomes. Also, in 2009, Atwater and Carmelli did an analysis that was performed by surveying employees' perception of their relationship with their leader, their creative work environment, and energy levels. So that information showed that exchanges with their leader was positively related to employees' feelings of energy, which in turn were related to high level of involvement in creative work. So again, it goes back to feeling empowered. You like that the employee likes that the leader wants their opinions, it likes that they're involved. And when you're motivated and empowered, you're more likely to have more creative ideas, you feel more energetic. So that's kind of what their research was showing. So some critiques on leader-member exchange theory. So Grain and Olbein mentioned in their work, a few of these, that it's time-consuming. So it really takes time from the leader to make a relationship with each and every one of their employees. So depending on how big that organization is, that's a lot of work and that's a lot of time. So it makes sense that they'd want to have good relationships so they could have their employees do the work so they can work on their relationships with everyone. I kind of thought that it sounded like favoritism in the workplace. A lot of articles mentioned that personality was a huge key in that, and I think that that can definitely form the in-group versus out-group. So I kind of took it as it sounded a little bit like cliquey or favoritism in the workplace. And I could also see how it could cause some animosity between coworkers. So if they didn't get along with the leader and they wanted to be a part of the in-group, but they just didn't quite understand each other, they would be a part of the out-group. So I can see how one coworker being in the in-group would be not quite get along with someone in the out-group just because they have differing outlooks on that job. Grain and Olbein also mentioned that that exchange can fall apart if the leader leaves, which would make sense because that leader makes a personal relationship with each follower. So I didn't realize it until I saw that in their article, but it makes sense. So if that leader goes and makes relationships with everyone and then they leave, it kind of starts them back at ground zero. And they also mentioned that it depends on the follower to show initiative. And I think that goes back to animosity. If there's someone who doesn't show initiative and there's someone that does, the one that shows initiative is going to get that attention because they want to work, they want to do well. And the one without initiative is going to put themselves in that out group because they don't want to go above and beyond. They're not having that extra energy. And here are my references.